The first glimpse. The first time anyone noticed 3I divided by Atlas. It was not a discovery marked by fireworks, press releases, or triumphant headlines. It was a silent observation in the midnight hours of a winter shift at an observatory high in the Chilean desert. A technician named Soraya, weary from the long night, leaned back from the console, only to notice a faint streak in the data, an irregular light moving against the pattern of known stars. At first, it seemed like a glitch, a smudge on the telescope's lens, but when she cross-checked with parallel instruments, the streak remained. It was faint, deliberate, and undeniably real. Across the world, similar fragments of observation began to surface, scattered like breadcrumbs. A team in Hawaii recorded it too, days later, noting how its brightness varied strangely, as if the object were wrapped in shifting layers of dust and gas, but not quite like any comet catalogued before. The light curve rose and fell as if pulsing, as though the traveler itself was breathing with rhythms deeper than human comprehension. Astronomers had seen interstellar wanderers before. 1I, Oumuamua, had passed silently in 2017, tilting like a shard of alien stone. 2I divided by Borisov had burned brighter in 2019, more comet than enigma. But 3I divided by Atlas was different. It did not simply pass through the solar system, it lingered, its path curving in unexpected ways, as if something unseen tugged at it. Computer models strained to explain its erratic momentum. Some claimed gravitational perturbations, others whispered of internal forces. None could agree. The first public mention was a small entry in an academic bulletin, a line buried among technical summaries. Unusual object detected with interstellar trajectory, provisional designation 3I divided by Atlas. No one outside the astronomical community noticed. The world was already drowning in distractions, politics, economics, crises of its own making. What was one more wandering rock in the sky? Yet, for the few who stared long enough at the data, there was unease. It was not just a comet. Its approach carried something more. As days stretched into weeks, the object grew brighter. Images revealed a nucleus scarred and jagged, like the shattered fragment of a world that had once been whole. Its tail, however, was unlike any comet's. Not a single spray of ice and dust, but streams breaking apart, weaving patterns that resembled harmonic waves. Astronomers debated, could solar radiation alone create such ordered turbulence? Some described it as if the object itself were singing through particles and gas. The discovery did not remain cloistered in observatories for long. Rumors slipped into late-night scientific forums, whispered between graduate students who were quick to spot anomalies others ignored. It's humming, one wrote, after overlaying wave spectrograms on its tail emissions. The frequency is not random, it matches resonant patterns close to Earth's own oceanic cycles. That single claim, dismissed by many, drew the attention of a quiet circle of researchers who had long studied the fragile synchrony of Earth's oceans. They leaned in, curious and uneasy. By the time the mainstream news outlets noticed Atlas, it was already too late to shape the narrative as an ordinary event. Amateur astronomers uploaded their own footage, grainy arcs of the comet, moving with disquieting steadiness across night skies. Its core seemed fractured, glowing irregularly, not with the cold fire of ice vaporizing, but with the faint shimmer of something older, deeper. The public compared it to a scar, a wound carried through space. To those who studied it closely, the analogy struck too close. Old records surfaced. During a press briefing, a journalist pulled a question from nowhere. How certain are we that 3I divided by Atlas is harmless? The panel froze. Scientists shifted in their seats. For the first time, the mask of calm confidence cracked. Words like unprecedented and poorly understood spilled out. For every attempt at reassurance, an unspoken weight lingered in the silence between sentences. The audience noticed. People always notice when the experts are afraid. Beyond public sight, in locked rooms, the discovery had already sparked classified discussions. Naval agencies compared satellite ocean data with the comet's rising resonance. Minuscule, almost imperceptible, but real. Patterns of waves in the Pacific, aligning with the comet's periodic fluctuations. Coincidence was the easiest explanation, yet the oceans have long memories, and scientists knew that resonance, once ignited, can amplify in ways no equations could easily contain. Meanwhile, Soraya returned to her console night after night. She had no clearance for the reports now passing through government networks. All she had were her images, her light curves, and her unease. She wrote her thoughts in notebooks, line after line of quiet fear she dared not speak aloud. To her, the object no longer seemed like a passive rock wandering by chance. It moved with intent, as if shaped by a history larger than any planet's memory. She wondered what world had birthed it, and what cataclysm had torn it apart, sending a scarred fragment across eternity to arrive, at last, here. And as Earth spun beneath indifferent stars, the first whispers began, not of light in the sky, but of swells upon the seas. Whispers in data. At first, the anomalies were faint, little ripples tucked inside endless streams of observational records that no one outside a dedicated handful of analysts would ever care to notice. Most of the data gathered from ocean buoys, deep-sea hydrophones, and satellite-mounted instruments looked normal. The usual dance of tides responding to winds, gravitational pulls, and seasonal currents. But when compared against the comet's trajectory, something unusual began to surface, an unspoken harmony threading the chaos. The Pacific Ocean, vast and seemingly untamable, showed signs of waves forming not where storms churned, not where trade winds shifted, but along lines of longitude and latitude that corresponded eerily to Atlas's orbital resonance. The signals were small, hardly enough to trouble a fisherman or even a coastal monitor, yet their timing was uncanny. One wave would crest a few centimeters higher than models predicted, another would fall perfectly out of sync with the moon's gravitational tug. Alone, each deviation was meaningless. Together, they painted a pattern as delicate as the threads of a spider's web, a web that seemed to vibrate when Atlas drew nearer. At an oceanographic institute in Reykjavik, a young postdoctoral researcher named Emil began connecting the dots. His project was simple: align real-time buoy measurements with theoretical tide models, but in the graphs that unfolded across his screen, he noticed consistent deviations, timed precisely with Atlas's periodic brightening. Emil thought it an error at first, a calibration issue. Yet when he checked across datasets Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, the same anomalies whispered through them all. They were not errors, they were fingerprints. In his excitement, Emil drafted a paper, Preliminary Observations of External Influences on Global Oceanic Resonance. He wrote carefully, cautiously, aware that bold claims would invite mockery. Still, he included the comet's designation in his notes, drawing a faint line between celestial movement and terrestrial water. He submitted it to his supervisor, who frowned, brows furrowed. "Delete Atlas," she advised. "Leave it as unexplained anomaly. You'll ruin your credibility otherwise." Emil obeyed outwardly but saved his original version in a hidden file, a digital journal of whispers no one else seemed willing to hear. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, quiet figures in grey suits pored over their own classified readings. Naval sonar arrays, tuned to detect submarines, had recorded subtle background vibrations unrelated to any vessel or known geological event. The hum rose and fell in tandem with Atlas's flickering emissions, not loud enough to trigger alarms but strange enough to raise questions. In secret reports stamped confidential maritime anomalies, analysts noted the coincidence, adding it to a growing catalogue of unexplained maritime irregularities. Meanwhile, in fishing villages scattered along Chile's rugged coastline, whispers took another form. Old men who had spent their lives at sea began noticing unusual patterns: fish fleeing shallower waters, sudden quiet at dawn when seabirds should have been restless, currents bending against the wind. They spoke of it in taverns, voices low, some saying the sea was listening to something far beyond the horizon. "It breathes differently," one fisherman muttered, staring at his nets, "like it waits for a voice." Satellite specialists also caught glimpses. Instruments designed to measure gravitational anomalies for geophysical surveys began registering faint, shifting signals in the ocean basins, anomalies too irregular to be tectonic, but too consistent to dismiss. When scientists attempted to model them, the simulations veered toward chaotic amplification, resonance waves stacking upon themselves until entire coastlines warped under impossible tides. These outcomes were theoretical, locked behind equations few would ever read. Yet the unease spread quietly among those who understood. Not everyone ignored the patterns. Independent researchers, scattered across online forums, began to connect data leaks, public readings, and amateur telescope reports. A few argued that Atlas was not merely a comet but an amplifier, a celestial body that somehow resonated with Earth's hydrosphere. They compared it to the way a singer's voice can shatter glass if tuned precisely to its frequency. The Earth, they suggested, was the glass. Atlas was the note. In their small communities, these researchers faced ridicule. Their posts were flagged, dismissed as pseudoscience, drowned beneath waves of skepticism. Still, their charts circulated quietly curves, showing wave anomalies aligned against Atlas's periodic emissions, patterns repeating across oceans thousands of kilometers apart. "It is not the tides alone," one anonymous poster wrote. "It is the deep water, the hidden seas, the mantle-fed reservoirs beneath us that are humming." Few believed, fewer still understood, but those who did began to feel dread curling at the edges of their thoughts. The anomalies spread to sound. Hydrophones along the Mariana Trench began recording low-frequency tones beyond natural seismic noise. The tones pulsed faintly, inaudible to human ears but measurable on spectrograms, repeating in intervals that mirrored Atlas's distance from Earth. When analysts slowed the recordings, the tones resembled a deep, rolling hum, like the echo of some vast organ deep beneath the waves. Scientists hesitated to publish. How could they explain such a phenomenon without opening themselves to ridicule? In one secure lab, a physicist compared the ocean's hum to the comet's light curve. He overlaid them, pulse against pulse, and watched as they aligned perfectly, like two dancers locked in silent choreography across millions of kilometers. He felt his throat tighten. "It's calling," he whispered before shutting off his monitor. He never shared the graph. As weeks passed, the whispers grew louder, not in sound, but in significance. More instruments, more deviations, more synchronicities between comet and ocean. Yet the world remained unaware. Ships continued to sail, tourists flocked to beaches, and coastal cities glowed at night as though nothing stirred in the depths. Only the quiet watchers, the scientists, the fishermen, the forgotten researchers in dimly lit rooms felt the weight of something building beneath the surface. And somewhere high above the Earth, in the void where Atlas drifted, the fractured wanderer glowed faintly, its jagged body releasing streams of dust that rippled like strings plucked by unseen fingers. The resonance was not loud yet, but it was growing, a whisper swelling toward a song no one was prepared to hear. Forgotten manuscripts. The whispers of resonance within the oceans might have remained confined to graphs, instruments, and late-night debates among anxious researchers, had it not been for an unlikely discovery in an archive far from telescopes and laboratories. It began in Lisbon, where an aging archivist named Duarte spent his life sorting through centuries of maritime records, logs from galleons, merchant ships, and war vessels that once ruled the waves. To him, each page was a ghostly echo of sailors long vanished, their words preserved in brittle ink and faded parchment. Most entries spoke of storms, sightings of strange beasts, or mundane complaints about dwindling supplies. But scattered throughout were oddities, cryptic notes of tides that rose without warning, of seas flattening into unnatural stillness, of coastal harbors swallowed by sudden surges on nights when no storm was present. At first, Duarte dismissed them as exaggerations, the sort of embellishments sailors often wove into their tales. Yet the more he read, the more a pattern emerged. The records were centuries apart, scattered across oceans, yet described events so similar they seemed linked by an invisible thread. Most curious of all were the dates. When he cross-referenced them with celestial charts, a handful aligned uncannily with sightings of unusual comets or wandering stars, noted in historical astronomical almanacs. Intrigued, Duarte reached out to a historian of science in Florence, Professor Belandi, who specialized in translating archaic astronomical manuscripts. Belandi dug into Renaissance observatory logs, finding scattered references to objects that appeared briefly, displayed erratic movement, and then vanished into the dark. One account from 1637 described a shattered star dragging a tail of broken fire, its light flickering as though alive. Mariners recorded unusual swells on that same date, their ships rocking in harbors that should have been calm. These were not isolated anecdotes. In the Qing dynasty archives, Chinese naval records documented mysterious black tides that rose against the moon's cycle, swallowing fishing villages without wind or rain. Priests recorded them as omens. In South America, among Jesuit missionary letters, descriptions surfaced of coastal tribes abandoning settlements overnight after the sea sang with a deep hum. Duarte realized that the resonance the modern scientists whispered about had left fingerprints before, etched not in instruments but in the collective memory of those who lived by the ocean's edge. Professor Belandi compiled fragments from across cultures, Babylonian star tablets, Polynesian chants, Norse sagas of a splintered flame that shook the waters. Time and again, the appearance of a wandering object coincided with strange disturbances in the sea. Some cultures treated them as punishments from the gods, others as harbingers of renewal, but none survived long enough to master the truth. Civilizations vanished mysteriously, leaving only shards of myth behind. The manuscript that most unsettled Belandi came from the 14th century, a Venetian copy of a lost Greek text attributed to a sailor philosopher named Theon. It described a night when the waters fled and returned, splitting the earth's skin with a thunder no mountain could withstand. Theon claimed the cause was a star broken in exile, crossing the heavens with wounds that bled light. The parallel to 3I divided by Atlas was uncanny, too precise to dismiss as coincidence. The discovery leaked slowly, first as academic chatter, then in niche journals where scholars dared suggest the possibility of celestial resonance events shaping history. Yet every attempt at serious publication was ridiculed. Peer reviewers dismissed it as myth-making, a fanciful blending of folklore and science. Still, the researchers persisted quietly, for the evidence refused to fade. What unsettled them most was the implication that Earth's oceans were not passive bystanders, but participants in a cosmic rhythm repeating across centuries. If the manuscripts were to be believed, these resonance events did not occur with every comet or interstellar traveler. They came only with the broken ones, shattered fragments that seemed to carry within them the memory of destruction. Atlas, with its scarred nucleus and fractured tail, fit the pattern too perfectly. In Reykjavik, Emil, still obsessing over his hidden file, found one of Belandi's translated manuscripts in an online archive. He read it late into the night, the words, "the sea sang," burning into his thoughts. He compared the timing with the modern anomalies he had recorded, and the alignment chilled him. It was not proof, but it was a whisper across centuries. Others had seen this before, and it had never ended quietly. Meanwhile, in fishing villages, the stories began to re-emerge in a different form. Elders who carried oral traditions spoke more openly now, recalling tales told by ancestors of seas that once rose higher than mountains in a single night. Most had dismissed them as metaphors, stories meant to teach respect for the ocean. But with Atlas brightening in the sky, those old stories carried new weight. Children whispered them in candlelight, fishermen repeated them at sea, and in their retellings, the memory of water deepened. Governments monitoring the growing chatter grew uneasy. Myths had a way of shaping fear faster than data ever could. Reports circulated within intelligence agencies about how old manuscripts and cultural legends might inflame public panic if linked to Atlas's passage. There were discussions of censorship, of managing the narrative, of keeping the comet framed as an ordinary visitor. Yet the manuscripts were already out there, digitized, and scattered across the world's networks. The whispers could not be contained. Duarte continued cataloguing his findings, driven by a quiet obsession. In his notes, he wrote a line he dared not publish. Perhaps the ocean does not simply respond, it remembers. Perhaps Atlas does not pass alone, it awakens something already here. He underlined the words, then locked the notebook in his drawer, uncertain whether he had uncovered knowledge or a curse. And still, across the night skies, Atlas drew closer, pulsing faintly, as though answering the forgotten manuscripts with a song of its own, the ocean's murmur. The manuscripts had laid bare echoes of the past, but in the present, the sea itself began to whisper in ways no ink or parchment could fully capture. Along coastlines, stretching from the South Pacific to the shores of West Africa, those who lived closest to the water were the first to notice that something was no longer as it should be. The ocean, their old companion, had begun to move with moods that defied centuries of knowledge passed from generation to generation. In the small port town of Puerto Cisnes in Chile, fishermen rose before dawn to prepare their boats, as their fathers and grandfathers had done. The bay was usually restless at that hour, wind curling down from the mountains, gulls shrieking for scraps, currents tugging in familiar directions. Yet on one cold morning, the water lay still as glass, silent, waiting. Nets hung slack, and the gulls never cried. When the fishermen launched their boats, they felt the uncanny sensation that the sea was not carrying them forward but drawing them inward, into itself, like a breath held too long. Reports of strange currents spread from village to village. In Indonesia, Pearl divers emerged pale and shaken after hearing low rumbles in the water, sounds that vibrated through their bones, though no engines or quakes explained them. They spoke of the ocean humming, a deep resonance that pulsed beneath the surface, so steady it felt alive. The younger divers laughed nervously, but the elders nodded grimly. They had heard such stories in lullabies sung to frighten children into respecting the sea songs about waves that rose from nowhere when the ocean grew restless. On the coast of Maine, lobster fishermen spoke of whirlpools forming suddenly in places where the water had always been calm. Their compasses spun erratically, and sonar returned ghostly images of shifting layers beneath the seabed, as if the ocean floor itself were trembling. "It's not the tide," one captain muttered, staring at his instruments. "It's something deeper, like the water's got its own heartbeat now." Satellite imagery confirmed some of these suspicions, though the data was carefully sequestered into classified archives. From above, vast gyres, the circular systems of currents that had long been mapped and trusted, showed irregular spirals forming inside them, small vortices that bent the flow unnaturally. Oceanographers struggled to explain them, resorting to technical jargon: micro-resonant turbulence, basin oscillation irregularities. Behind closed doors, however, they admitted the truth. The seas were moving to a rhythm they did not understand, and that rhythm seemed to be growing louder with each passing week as Atlas approached. The most unnerving phenomenon of all was silence. Coastal dwellers began noticing mornings when the sea grew utterly still, not a ripple disturbing its surface, not a bird daring to cry. Fishermen refused to launch on such days, convinced the ocean was listening to something beyond human hearing. Dogs would howl on beaches, restless, pawing at the sand as though warning their masters to stay away. In Manila, an old sailor named Elias returned from a night voyage with a story that spread quickly through the harbor. He claimed that as he steered his small boat into open waters, he felt the sea pull beneath him, not in waves but in a single, vast sway, as though the whole basin moved together. He described it like being carried on the chest of a sleeping giant as it stirred. No storm had been present, no tremor recorded, yet the sensation left him trembling. "The sea is answering something in the sky," he told those gathered at the docks. Some laughed nervously, others crossed themselves, but all fell quiet when they noticed the rising glow of Atlas above the horizon, flickering like a fractured scar in the heavens. Science did not ignore these accounts. Buoy networks confirmed slight but consistent deviations in tidal behavior. Though still minor, mere centimeters at most, they defied prediction models with unnerving precision. Each anomaly coincided with fluctuations in Atlas's emissions. The comet was no longer simply passing through the solar system, it was already speaking to Earth, and Earth, through its oceans, was beginning to respond. A small circle of oceanographers in Norway conducted clandestine experiments, feeding wave data into harmonic resonance simulations. The results startled them. Under certain alignments, even a faint external frequency could, if sustained, stack upon natural oscillations until entire basins moved in catastrophic unison. One researcher likened it to pushing a child on a swing. Just the right timing, even with the smallest of nudges, could send the swing higher and higher until control was lost. In his report, never published, he wrote simply, "The oceans are the swing, Atlas is pushing." What terrified him most was that there was no mechanism to stop it. Resonance, once engaged, did not require constant force. A few well-timed pulses could set the entire planet's hydrosphere into motion, amplifying itself until equilibrium broke in ways no model could predict. Meanwhile, myths began to resurface in the very places where the ocean now murmured. In Polynesian villages, chants once dismissed as poetic metaphors suddenly seemed prophetic, songs of the sea that remembers the sky. In the coastal highlands of Peru, families recalled stories passed from ancestors of nights when the ocean rose in silence, swallowing entire valleys before dawn. The old stories aligned too well with the patterns now emerging, fueling unease that spread faster than any official reassurance could contain. Governments sought to suppress panic, but the murmurs could not be silenced. A fisherman in Ghana uploaded a recording of the ocean's strange hum, captured with a simple waterproof microphone. The clip went viral, an eerie, low frequency that seemed less like water and more like a great bell tolling beneath the sea. Scientists scrambled to dismiss it as background seismic noise, but the sound lodged itself in the public imagination. People began to ask, What if the Earth itself was ringing in response to something far away? By now, Atlas was a visible scar in the sky, faint but unmistakable, a broken wanderer trailing dust that shimmered unnaturally. Its presence lent weight to every strange tide, every whispered rumor. To those watching closely, the comet was no longer a distant curiosity. It was a question hanging above them, unanswered, as the oceans below shifted in ways too precise to ignore. And in the quiet between tides, the sea seemed to wait as if listening for the next note in a song only it could hear. The resonance hypothesis. By the time the murmurs of the ocean began surfacing in public whispers and scattered reports, the scientific community had already locked itself into quiet, desperate debates behind closed doors. It was no longer a matter of coincidence. The comet's fractured emissions, the humming tones buried in hydrophone data, the subtle surges detected in tide gauges, together they painted a troubling picture. And though no one dared say it outright in public, within laboratories and hushed conferences, the phrase had begun to circulate with grim inevitability: the resonance hypothesis. It was first articulated formally by Dr. Anja Marovic, a geophysicist based in Prague, though her colleagues later admitted the idea had been lingering in their minds for weeks. In a sealed white paper circulated among international agencies, she described the oceans not as passive bodies of water, but as resonant chambers, colossal basins, capable of amplifying external forces if tuned with precision. Earth's hydrosphere is not inert, she wrote. It is an instrument. Under the right conditions, it will play. Her models were sobering. With the smallest of nudges, an oscillation aligned to the natural frequencies of Earth's ocean, basins' waves could begin stacking upon themselves, growing not linearly but exponentially. Marovich likened it to the collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, when a gentle but consistent wind pushed the structure into catastrophic resonance. If something as fragile as a bridge could be torn apart by resonance, what of an entire ocean? At first, her peers resisted. The idea seemed too apocalyptic, too uncomfortably poetic for hard science. Yet the data kept pulling them toward the same conclusion. When researchers overlaid Atlas's emissions with wave anomalies, the timing was too exact. Every faint brightening of the comet's fractured nucleus seemed to coincide with subtle oscillations in the Pacific, as though the two were locked in dialogue. The implication was staggering. A broken wanderer from interstellar space was tuning Earth's oceans, pushing them like a pendulum. Simulations grew darker as they became more refined. Teams in Japan fed buoy records into supercomputers, adjusting variables to account for Atlas's periodic activity. What the machines produced was not a storm, nor a single great wave, but a chain reaction. Resonance waves building silently across entire basins, invisible at first, then rising in unison. In some models, the surge would not stop at a single coastline. Instead, it would ripple inward, pushing tectonic plates with the weight of entire seas. The phrase that haunted every report was runaway amplification. Once resonance reached a critical point, no counterforce existed to stop it. The oceans would simply obey their new rhythm, splitting continents as casually as a singer's note might shatter glass. Still, the scientists hesitated to release their findings to the public. Memories of past hysteria, predictions of planetary alignments destroying Earth, Mayan calendars heralding apocalypse haunted them. To speak too soon would be to invite ridicule, to see their warnings dismissed as superstition. And yet silence was a different kind of risk, for the resonance, if real, would not wait for consensus. Meanwhile, smaller voices carried the message in underground forums and obscure journals. Independent physicists, free from the fear of institutional backlash, began publishing crude but passionate diagrams, showing Earth as a vast resonant body. "We think of the planet as solid," one wrote, "but it is mostly liquid in motion. The seas, the magma, the air, they all hum. Atlas is not hitting Earth with force, it is playing it like an instrument." The metaphor spread, unsettling in its simplicity. The idea of Earth as an instrument struck a chord with poets, musicians, and conspiracy theorists alike. On social media, eerie sonifications of hydrophone recordings were shared widely. Slowed-down tones that pulsed like a heartbeat, paired with images of the comet's fractured glow. Even as official channels denied any connection, the resonance hypothesis began seeping into public consciousness, half rumor, half dread. Governments watched nervously. Internal memos circulated in defense ministries across Europe and Asia, acknowledging the hypothesis privately, even as they censored public discussion. The danger was not merely physical but psychological. If populations began to believe their world was about to split beneath them, panic could unravel societies before the seas ever did. In one leaked transcript of a closed-door meeting, a minister asked quietly, "If resonance truly comes, what can we do?" The silence that followed was broken only by a scientist's bleak reply, "Nothing. You cannot silence an echo once it has begun." What unsettled the experts most was the comet's nature itself. Unlike Borisov or Oumuamua, Atlas was not a simple traveler. Its fractured body released emissions irregularly, pulsing like the strum of a broken chord. That irregularity made it unpredictable, yet it also made it more dangerous, for irregular pulses could match more than one frequency, touching not only ocean basins but perhaps tectonic layers as well. The possibility of resonance extending beneath the crust, of the seas and the land vibrating together, was mentioned only in the most secretive reports, and never allowed. And yet, amid the fear, there was denial. A portion of the scientific community clung stubbornly to conventional explanations. They argued the anomalies were artifacts of climate models, consequences of global warming, shifts in currents misunderstood as cosmic influence. It was easier, after all, to blame the known than to face the terrifying possibility of an interstellar scar shaking the world's foundation. But those who had stared too long at the overlapping graphs knew better. Their nights were sleepless, their hearts heavy, for they could feel the ocean beginning to stir. Dr. Maravik herself, pacing her narrow apartment late into the night, wrote in her private notes, "The comet is not colliding with Earth, nor passing quietly by. It is reminding the oceans of a song they once knew. We have forgotten it, but the water has not." And outside her window, the rivers that ran through Prague shimmered faintly under the broken light of Atlas, flowing towards seas that hummed with the first strains of a resonance not yet unleashed, shadows of catastrophe. The resonance hypothesis, whispered at first and then reluctantly acknowledged in private circles, did not remain confined to academic journals and confidential simulations. Inevitably, fragments of the most secretive analyses began to slip beyond their intended walls, carried by leaks, by whispers between fearful colleagues, and by the quiet persistence of those who could not bear to keep silent in the face of what they had seen. These leaks formed a tapestry of dread, scattered pieces of a larger picture, each one painting Earth's oceans not as guardians of life but as weapons waiting to be struck. The first leak came not from a scientist, but from an analyst within a naval intelligence division. His job had been routine: compare hydrophone anomalies against known submarine traffic. Yet the reports he reviewed told of global-scale vibrations that matched no craft, no tectonic activity, nothing natural. The classified summary stated bluntly, "Unidentified periodic oscillations correlate with Object 3I divided by Atlas. Simulations predict Bayesian-scale amplification under specific alignments. Potential threat assessment, catastrophic." The word catastrophic was underlined twice. The analyst, shaken, copied the document and slipped it to a journalist he trusted. The journalist, bound by fear of legal reprisals, did not publish outright but shared it anonymously with other contacts. Within weeks, it spread like an invisible tide, surfacing in obscure corners of the internet, where scientists and conspiracy theorists alike pounced upon it. For the first time, the resonance hypothesis was no longer speculation. It had the weight of government acknowledgement behind it, however unofficial. Other leaks followed. A European climate research group had been running restricted models integrating oceanographic data with comet emission cycles. Their simulations produced horrific outcomes. Waves not of 10 or 20 meters, but surges spanning thousands of kilometers, walls of water moving with the unified force of entire ocean basins. The report described a scenario in which resonance triggered across the Pacific, creating a single pulse so vast it would split upon impact, with continental shelves sending secondary waves tearing inland for hundreds of miles. The phrase used was continent-level inundation. One reviewer scrawled a margin note, "No human infrastructure survives this." In Tokyo, a scientist involved in seismic monitoring leaked an even more unsettling correlation. Seismographs were recording faint tremors that coincided not with tectonic stress, but with the comet's periodic flares. It was as though the very crust of the Earth was beginning to hum, echoing the ocean's resonance. If true, it meant that Atlas's influence might not be confined to water alone. It might tug at the mantle, the plates, the very skeleton of the planet. In one confidential interview, the scientist admitted, "We are not talking only about waves, we are talking about fractures. A single night could redraw the map of the world." The phrase planet-killing waves appeared in one of the darkest documents, a leaked defense analysis from an American agency. It described not only flooding but the possibility of resonance driving, tectonic slippage, chain reactions of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and continental rifts. In its stark conclusion, it warned, "Scenario outcome is consistent with civilizational collapse. Risk period, within months of perihelion passage." The document was never meant for public eyes, but fragments appeared on anonymous forums, fueling a storm of speculation. Governments responded with silence. Official spokespeople dismissed the rumors as misinterpretations of scientific data, insisting that Atlas posed no threat beyond the spectacle of its passing, yet their very refusal to engage deepened suspicion. Citizens noticed the sudden increase in coastal monitoring, the quiet deployment of naval vessels equipped with advanced sensors, the abrupt cancellations of maritime drills. Silence became louder than admission. Among scientists, the leaks sowed division. Some condemned the disclosures as reckless fear-mongering that would erode public trust in science. Others admitted, in private, that perhaps fear was necessary, that the world needed to know the scale of what might come. But even those who believed in transparency hesitated. How could they explain to ordinary people that the oceans themselves might rise in unison? That continents could split not by collision but by resonance, that no walls or levees or shelters could defend against the planet's own waters turning against it? Whispers of old manuscripts returned to the conversation. Leaked reports referenced them cautiously, as historical analogues, though the language was deliberately clinical. In footnotes, analysts acknowledged that ancient accounts of sudden deluges and vanished civilizations might represent earlier resonance events triggered by interstellar fragments. To the few who read those lines, the implication was unbearable. This had happened before, and it had left scars upon humanity's oldest myths. In Reykjavik, Emil read the leaks late at night, heart pounding. The words aligned too perfectly with his hidden files, the anomalies he had traced in secret. He realized he was no longer an outlier. The fear he had felt in isolation was shared across the globe, hidden behind layers of classification and silence. Yet this knowledge brought him no comfort. If anything, it deepened the dread, for he understood that silence meant one thing: those in power had no solution. For ordinary people, the leaks reached them not as full reports but as fragments, images of graphs, snippets of sentences, blurry screenshots of classified pages. Yet fragments were enough. Panic stirred in forums, in news comment sections, in whispered conversations at seaside towns. Some laughed it off, clinging to denial. Others began stockpiling supplies, abandoning coastal homes, fleeing inland. Governments called them alarmists, but their departure marked the beginning of a quiet exodus. The darkest part of the leaks was not the numbers, not the simulations of surging waves or fractured continents. It was the inevitability written between the lines. Every report agreed on one point. Once resonance reached critical alignment, there would be no means of halting it. Earth itself would answer the comet's call, and humanity would have no more power to stop it than to silence thunder. And high above, glowing faintly with a fractured halo, Atlas drifted closer, a scarred wanderer trailing the memory of its own destruction, preparing to teach Earth what it had already done to another world. A meeting in silence. The leaks had forced the matter into the open, at least in whispers and scattered rumors. But in the halls of power, leaders and their advisors had already been summoned into quiet, urgent meetings, where words were spoken in hushed tones and recorded only in memories and encrypted notes. These meetings were not broadcast, not announced. They took place in hidden chambers, beneath government complexes, in anonymous conference rooms within international organizations, and aboard military vessels drifting in neutral waters. The first of these occurred in Geneva, under the guise of a routine security summit. Delegates arrived by night, their convoys unmarked, their schedules cleared of public appearances. Behind closed doors, they gathered around a long table, lit dimly by recessed lamps, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken dread. At the head sat a representative from the International Maritime Observatory, a gaunt man with trembling hands who spread a folder of restricted reports across the polished surface. No one interrupted as he spoke, his voice steady but faint, as though carrying the weight of inevitability. He laid out the resonance hypothesis, stripped of metaphor and softened language. He showed graphs of hydrophone anomalies, wave patterns synchronized with Atlas's emissions, simulations of cascading resonance that transformed oceans into weapons against their own shores. Each slide was more devastating than the last. The delegates watched, pale and silent, their faces illuminated by the shifting graphs that spelled not policy debates but extinction scenarios. When he finished, silence lingered like a fog. Finally, a minister from the Pacific Rim spoke, her voice trembling. "If this is true, why is it not already public?" The man did not answer at once. He simply closed his folder and said quietly, "Because the moment it becomes public, you will lose your people before the water ever reaches them." That was the core of every secret meeting that followed. The question of disclosure. Governments were not blind to the risk. They understood that resonance, if it reached its crescendo, could tear apart cities, split continents, and drown civilizations. But they also understood panic. What would happen to the global economy if millions fled inland? What wars might erupt over dwindling farmland as coastal refugees poured across borders? How many would die in chaos before the first wave even arrived? In Washington, a similar meeting unfolded in a chamber beneath the Capitol. Intelligence officials outlined the latest classified findings, emphasizing words like potential and uncertain, though their eyes betrayed the certainty they dared not voice. A senator asked whether underground shelters could protect the population. A general replied bluntly, "From water perhaps, from continents splitting, no." Another asked whether Atlas itself could be diverted, intercepted, destroyed. The answer was silence, then a slow shake of the head. Atlas was not a missile to shoot down. It was a scarred fragment the size of a mountain, moving faster than any weapon could touch. It would pass, yes, but in passing, it could sing the oceans into fury. In Moscow, the atmosphere was harsher. Military officials framed the resonance hypothesis as an opportunity. If disclosed selectively, it could be used to manipulate populations, to gain geopolitical leverage, to justify territorial expansions under the guise of safety corridors. Scientists in the room protested, warning that resonance knew no borders, that the oceans could not be tamed by flags. Their protests were ignored. Fear, once politicized, is rarely allowed to remain pure. Yet in every meeting, regardless of country or ideology, the same haunting phrase was repeated. One night. It would not be gradual, not a slow erosion of coastlines over decades. If the resonance reached its breaking point, the catastrophe would unfold in a single night, perhaps a few hours, the seas convulsing in unison. The speed of the collapse made planning almost meaningless. There would be no time for evacuation on that night. There would only be survival, or not. Some leaders argued for secrecy, insisting that disclosure would achieve nothing but panic. Others insisted that humanity had the right to know, to prepare however it could. But when the question was put to a vote, secrecy prevailed by slim margins. "We will monitor," they said. "We will prepare contingencies. We will not announce what we cannot prevent." And with those words, billions of people across the world were quietly denied knowledge of the waves that might one day rise beneath them. Not everyone obeyed. In the margins of these meetings, dissenters emerged. A handful of scientists smuggled out fragments of their presentations, planting seeds of truth in underground forums, disguised as speculation but grounded in data. A few officials, racked with guilt, leaked transcripts to trusted journalists, knowing they risked careers, even lives. These rebels understood that silence was another kind of death, one inflicted slowly, leaving humanity unprepared for the moment the oceans rose. In Reykjavik, Emil received one such leak anonymously, a transcript from the Geneva summit. Reading it by candlelight in his small apartment, he felt as though the words themselves weighed upon his chest. "We will not announce what we cannot prevent." He closed his eyes and thought of the manuscripts, the old stories of civilizations swallowed in silence. Had they too been governed by leaders who chose secrecy? Had the past drowned not just in water, but in withheld truths? Meanwhile, far above the earth, Atlas continued its slow approach. Through telescopes, its fractured body glimmered, a wound frozen in the void. To ordinary eyes, it was no more than a faint, beautiful light. But to those who had sat in those secret meetings, it was a harbinger. Every flicker was a reminder that silence would not stop the resonance. The ocean was already listening. The night would come regardless of what was spoken or concealed. Origins of the Wanderer. Even as political chambers echoed with silence and compromise, the scientific world turned its gaze not just toward Earth's oceans, but back to the thing itself, the broken wanderer that drifted steadily nearer, trailing its fractured tail like a wound bleeding into the void. The question was no longer, what will it do to us? But what is it, truly? For though comets had visited before, Atlas refused to fit into any familiar mold. Its orbit was interstellar, its body jagged and unstable, its emissions irregular, more akin to a signal than a natural outgassing. It was in a research lab outside Heidelberg that the first unsettling clue emerged. A spectroscopic analysis, conducted with one of Europe's most advanced telescopes, revealed that Atlas carried minerals rarely seen in comets, complex silicates, fused at temperatures so high they should not have survived the cold of interstellar space. More disturbing still, fragments of its spectral fingerprint suggested materials that had been altered by pressures consistent with planetary interiors. Atlas was not just a comet, it was the shard of something larger, something once whole. The data spread quietly among astronomers, shared in private correspondence and encrypted files. Many resisted the implications, clinging to natural explanations, yet the evidence grew stronger with each new observation. Atlas did not resemble a frozen ball of ice and dust drifting from a starless gulf. It resembled the corpse of a shattered world. Some hypothesized that Atlas was the remnant of a rogue planet, ripped apart by a collision in some distant system and flung into interstellar exile. Others speculated that it was the fragment of a failed protoplanet, torn apart before it could coalesce into something stable. Whatever its origin, one fact became increasingly clear. Its scars told the story of violence. The fractures across its nucleus were not the cracks of ice sublimating under solar heat. They were deep wounds, jagged rents, as if an entire crust had been ripped apart. This idea, unsettling enough, grew darker when researchers realized that Atlas was not alone. Its trajectory suggested it might once have been part of a cluster, other fragments, perhaps smaller, perhaps lost in the void. Some might already have passed through the galaxy unnoticed. Some might be still out there, wandering. And if resonance was indeed real, then Earth was not the first world to hear the song of a broken wanderer. It was merely the next. The theory gained further weight when ancient myths were re-examined through this lens. Cultures across continents told of shattered stars, of broken worlds whose fragments crossed the heavens. What if these were not poetic inventions but memories, ancestral echoes of times when fragments like Atlas had brushed past Earth before, stirring the oceans into rebellion? What if entire civilizations had been erased not by floods alone, but by the resonance of a scarred wanderer remembering its own destruction? In a classified NASA report, never meant for public release, scientists compared Atlas's structure with data from exoplanet surveys. They concluded, in cautious phrasing, that Atlas was consistent with planetary crustal material under severe compressive stress. In plainer words, this was not a comet at all. It was the broken skin of a world, the remains of a planet that had once orbited a sun, harbored oceans, perhaps even life. Now it was debris, a scar carried through eternity, bleeding resonance into every system it passed. For some scientists, the realization was devastating. They had spent lifetimes studying the cosmos as a cradle of wonders, filled with stars birthing planets, planets birthing life. But Atlas told another story, that the universe was also a graveyard, littered with the corpses of worlds torn apart by forces too vast to comprehend. Looking upon its scarred surface, they could not help but see Earth reflected in its ruin. In Reykjavik, Emil downloaded a leaked fragment of the spectroscopic data, his pulse quickening as he recognized the implications. He thought of Duarte's manuscripts, of sailors who described stars broken in exile, of oceans that rose in their wake. The comet was not an intruder, it was a survivor, carrying within its fractured body the memory of another planet's death. The resonance was not a coincidence. It was a wound calling to water, as though the ocean itself could recognize the echo of a world it once belonged to. Among mythologists, the revelation carried a strange resonance of its own. The Polynesian chant that spoke of the sea that remembers the sky took on new meaning. Perhaps the oceans did remember not just Earth's sky, but the memory of water on other worlds, the silent kinship of seas that once covered planets now long destroyed. Governments, terrified of mass panic, suppressed these findings. To admit that Atlas was the shard of a shattered planet was to admit that worlds could die, that planets were fragile, that Earth itself could be broken as easily as a glass in a singer's hand. Instead, they released carefully worded statements describing Atlas as an unusual interstellar comet, a curiosity, a harmless wonder for skywatchers. Meanwhile, deep in hidden labs, they stared at models predicting what might happen when Earth's oceans recognized the song of a scarred wanderer. Above them all, Atlas drifted closer, gleaming faintly, its tail shedding fragments like a wound that never healed. To the naked eye, it was beautiful. To those who knew its origins, it was a ghost, the memory of a planet that had already endured what Earth now feared. And for those who watched the seas, the murmurs were no longer subtle. The oceans were listening more intently now, as if recognizing a voice long forgotten, a story older than Earth. By the time spectroscopic data confirmed what many scientists had already suspected, that Atlas was not a mere comet, but the scarred fragment of a destroyed world, the conversation began to shift from physics to memory. It was no longer just a question of what Atlas was, but why its approach felt strangely familiar. Myths, legends, and forgotten manuscripts had already been resurfacing in academic circles. Yet now mythologists and historians were invited into the conversation, not as quaint custodians of folklore, but as reluctant witnesses to truths humanity had long dismissed as metaphor. In Florence, Professor Belandi, who had translated the Venetian copy of Theon's ancient manuscript, was called to a private gathering of scholars. They met not in a university hall but in an old monastery, its walls lined with dusty volumes that had survived centuries of fire and war. There, by candlelight, they compared records from civilizations separated by oceans and millennia. Again and again, the same story appeared. The sky split by a wandering star, the seas rising in rebellion, entire peoples swallowed by a flood that came not with rain but with silence. The Polynesians spoke of the sea that remembers the sky. The Mesopotamians wrote of Abzu, the deep waters rising at the command of a broken star. The Norse sagas told of Ragnarok, where seas would drown the world after the sky cracked open. Even the Mayan Popol Vuh described great floods unleashed not by storms, but by celestial events. Across continents, across cultures, the story repeated with unnerving precision. The scholars realized what had always seemed impossible. Humanity's oldest myths might not be allegories. They might be records distorted by memory, but rooted in events as real as the tides. Belandi read aloud a passage from an obscure Babylonian tablet. The waters obeyed the scar of the sky, and the land broke where the seas struck together. He set the tablet down with trembling hands, his voice breaking. They saw it, they lived it, and they did not survive it. Silence followed, broken only by the shifting of robes and the crackle of the candle flame. The room felt less like a scholarly meeting, and more like a funeral for civilizations already lost. Meanwhile, in South America, indigenous elders began recounting oral histories long dismissed by modern ears. In the Andes, Quechua storytellers spoke of valleys that had been cut by water in a single night, their ancestors forced to flee to highlands while lowland civilizations disappeared forever. In the Pacific Islands, old songs told of ancestors who followed the stars inland when the sea rose without storm. These were not vague myths but detailed instructions for survival, maps encoded in song, guiding people to higher ground when the sky sent its broken star. What unsettled scholars most was the timing. When they traced these myths back through generations, cross-referencing them with geological evidence of sudden, unexplained floods, they aligned eerily with orbital projections of interstellar fragments that might once have brushed Earth. The cycle was too long for memory, yet somehow humanity had preserved it in fragments, in symbols, in stories told around fires for thousands of years. Perhaps, some suggested, survival itself had depended on remembering. In Reykjavik, Emil immersed himself in these studies, poring over digital archives late into the night. He realized with growing dread that the resonance hypothesis was not new. It was ancient, older than science, older than civilization. What Maravik and her colleagues modeled with equations, ancient sailors had described in simple words: seas that hummed, waters that rose, lands that split. The resonance of Atlas was not a discovery. It was a return. Governments tried to dismiss these connections as pseudo-archaeology, but whispers spread nonetheless. Online forums filled with side-by-side comparisons. Ancient flood myths on one side, satellite graphs of ocean anomalies on the other. People began to speak not of coincidence, but of recurrence. "We've seen this before," one poster wrote, "and we told ourselves stories so we wouldn't forget. We forgot anyway." He set Schnocken strong. In coastal towns, those stories took on new life. Children repeated them in playgrounds, parents whispered them as warnings, and old fishermen told them in taverns where once they had been only entertainment. In Ghana, storytellers revived a tale of the night when water walked. In Iceland, sagas of the sea swallowing whole fjords were recited once more. This time with trembling voices. The past was no longer distant. It was breathing at their doors. Among the scholars, a terrible realization emerged. If Atlas was the fragment of a destroyed planet, and if its resonance had touched Earth before, then perhaps Earth was not unique. Perhaps other worlds had oceans too. Oceans that had once answered the song of broken wanderers, only to rise and destroy the civilizations upon them. In this light, the myths of drowned cities Atlantis, Ys, Lemuria were no longer dismissed as fantasy. They became warnings, their truth lying not in location but in pattern. Civilizations rise, oceans remember, a broken star calls, and the waters obey. The myths carried another, subtler warning. In nearly every version, the catastrophe struck in darkness at night, when the stars blazed and the sea rose silently. The storytellers emphasized this detail again and again. It did not come with storms, nor with earthquakes first. It came with silence, with a night where the sea seemed to breathe differently, and by morning the land was gone. This was the true terror of resonance. Not chaos, not roaring winds, but an ocean moving as one, calm yet unstoppable, splitting continents in its path. As Atlas brightened in the night sky, people found themselves staring upward not with wonder but with unease. The broken light of the wanderer seemed to flicker in time with the old stories, as if confirming them. Scientists warned against superstition, but the myths had already taken root in the public mind. They were not seen as allegory anymore, but as prophecy. And as myths converged with science, one thought began to crystallize across minds both scholarly and ordinary. Perhaps Atlas was not just the fragment of a lost world. Perhaps it was a messenger, carrying the memory of destruction across the stars. Perhaps its song was older than Earth itself. The oceans, now visibly restless in their murmurs and deviations, seemed to agree. The sky turns restless. By now, Atlas had become more than a faint curiosity in the night sky. It had grown brighter with each passing week, its jagged body glimmering like a fractured lantern, its tail shimmering not with the graceful sweep of an ordinary comet but with a stuttering glow, as though the cosmos itself struggled to remember what it had once been. People looked up and felt unease they could not name. They spoke of its light as unstable, flickering like a wounded flame. Children pointed to it and asked if stars could bleed. The first changes in the sky came quietly, almost unnoticed. In northern latitudes, auroras appeared more frequently, not only during geomagnetic storms but on clear, calm nights. Curtains of green and violet unfurled across horizons where no aurora should exist, shimmering with strange patterns that defied familiar arcs. Amateur skywatchers posted videos of the lights rippling in waves, as though the heavens themselves were mirroring the ocean's restless motion below. Scientists at first dismissed them as solar anomalies, the result of subtle fluctuations in the sun's wind. Yet the timing betrayed them. Each appearance coincided with the comet's irregular emissions, its fractured nucleus brightening in sudden bursts. Pilots flying transpolar routes began reporting disturbances in their instruments. Compass readings faltered, altimeters flickered, radios filled with low, pulsing static that seemed to beat like a hidden drum. They described nights when the sky seemed alive with unseen movement, when their cockpits glowed faintly with ghostly lights that crawled across metal panels. Aviation authorities downplayed these accounts, but pilots knew what they saw, and many carried their unease back to the ground with silent determination not to speak too loudly of it. In rural Alaska, hunters whispered of skies that sang. On still nights, when auroras burned silently above, they claimed to hear faint hums echoing through the air, low and steady, as if the atmosphere itself vibrated. Instruments later confirmed infrasound pulses too low for the human ear, but powerful enough to resonate with the body. Those sensitive enough felt it as pressure in their bones, a subtle weight pressing down. The hums, too, matched the timing of Atlas's emissions. Satellite operators faced their own troubles. Communication satellites glitched inexplicably, their signals bent and scrambled by magnetic disturbances not tied to solar activity. A pattern emerged. Whenever Atlas brightened, disruptions followed, as if the wanderer's fractured presence sent invisible ripples through the planet's magnetic veil. Engineers wrote it off as coincidence, but the logs kept piling up, undeniable in their synchronicity. For the public, the sky itself began to change character. In equatorial regions, where auroras had never been seen, faint veils of light appeared briefly at night, shimmering in unnatural colors. Farmers in Kenya looked up from their fields to find the heavens streaked with pale ribbons of red, glowing faintly like a wound in the firmament. Children in Brazil cheered, pointing upward in delight, while their elders watched with quiet dread. Beauty, in this case, was omen. Religious leaders took notice. In sermons and gatherings across the world, voices rose to claim the lights as signs. Prophecies come alive. Some declared them warnings, others promises. The faithful saw in Atlas the fulfillment of ancient words, the herald of judgment or renewal. Their voices carried far, filling the silence left by governments who refused to speak. In the absence of answers, belief filled the void, and the restless sky became scripture for a frightened age. In scientific circles, the language grew darker. Magnetometers recorded fluctuations, aligned not with Earth's rotation, but with Atlas's pulsing emissions. Seismologists noticed faint but uncanny correlations between auroral surges and tremors beneath the crust, as if the sky and ground were bound by invisible strings. The world seemed to be vibrating in harmony with the scarred wanderer, the entire planet caught in a growing web of resonance that no longer touched only water, but atmosphere and stone alike. One report, leaked from an observatory in Canada, described the lights as plasma echoes, distortions caused by unseen waves moving between Earth and Atlas. The comet is not simply reflecting sunlight, the report concluded. It is emitting something, perhaps remnants of its destruction, perhaps frequencies unknown to us. The atmosphere hears it, the oceans hear it, the crust may hear it as well. The implications terrified those who understood them. Earth was not merely being illuminated by a passing fragment, it was being played like an instrument, its seas, its skies, and its bones vibrating in tune with the wanderer's broken song. In Reykjavik, Emil watched the auroras dance across the night, brighter and stranger than he had ever seen in his homeland. He felt no wonder, only dread, for in their restless light he saw confirmation of everything the manuscripts had whispered, that when the sky turns strange and the seas grow silent, the night of fracture is near. He wrote in his notebook, "The comet is not a visitor, it is a reminder. The sky trembles as the sea listens. Earth is already answering." His no-finder becomes his bid. As Atlas brightened further, visible now even to casual stargazers, millions lifted their eyes and felt something stir within them. It was awe, yes, but threaded with fear, the sense that the heavens themselves were no longer still, that something vast and wounded had entered their world's rhythm. The sky had turned restless, and in its glow, people felt the first true shadow of the night to come, the unheard warning. While the skies above bent and shimmered with lights out of place, while the oceans below grew restless in their unnatural hums, a small number of people tried to speak the truth aloud. They were not the ministers in secret rooms, nor the scientists bound by non-disclosure clauses and security clearances. They were the independents, the forgotten professors, the unfunded researchers, the quiet observers who lived at the edges of academia and technology. Their warnings were not polished press releases. They came in blog posts, in late-night live streams, in obscure academic forums that few cared to visit. Yet for those who listened, the message was clear. Something was happening, something vast and dangerous, and no one with power dared to admit it. In Prague, Dr. Anja Marovic, the very physicist who had first articulated the resonance hypothesis in a sealed white paper, watched with despair as governments dismissed her models. Bound by the restrictions of her position, she could not speak publicly under her own name, but she leaked fragments of her equations onto anonymous channels, attaching them to posts under the pseudonym Irenaeus. The graphs showed wave amplification curves spiraling upward, red lines slashing across continents as oceans split under the weight of resonance. Few outside her circle recognized the technical language, but those who did felt cold settle into their bones. In California, a small group of independent astrophysicists live-streamed their nightly observations of Atlas. Their telescopes, modest compared to the great observatories, nonetheless revealed the comet's fractured emissions with startling clarity. They showed viewers the irregular pulses of brightness, mapping them against oceanic anomalies pulled from public buoy data. "Look," one researcher whispered to the camera, his voice shaking. "The comet blinks, and the water answers." Their streams gathered small but loyal audiences, people drawn not by spectacle but by unease. Yet the mainstream press ignored them, and government agencies quietly labeled their work as unverified speculation. Enforcing this strictly. In Japan, a seismologist named Haruto recorded videos explaining how the timing of low-frequency tremors matched Atlas's emissions. He spoke carefully, aware of ridicule, yet his eyes betrayed his fear. "The Earth is humming," he said in one recording. "It is not tectonics alone. It is as though the planet itself is listening." His videos were shared widely on underground networks, but soon his account was suspended, his work dismissed by officials as climate noise misinterpretation. He stopped posting, though rumors claimed he continued his research in private, haunted by the numbers he could not unsee. Online, the warnings multiplied. Fishermen uploaded recordings of strange hums from their harbors. Amateur pilots shared stories of instruments spinning madly when auroras flared. Parents in equatorial villages filmed skies turning red with shimmering veils of light. The evidence was scattered, anecdotal, often ridiculed, but its sheer volume began to form a picture that no official narrative could erase. The world itself was warning, and people were beginning to notice, yet official voices spoke louder. Press conferences framed Atlas as a beautiful celestial visitor, harmless, inspiring wonder. Astronomical societies issued carefully worded statements about misinterpretations of natural phenomena. When reporters pressed for answers about leaked documents and growing anomalies, officials smiled thinly and spoke of internet hysteria. The louder the warnings became from independent voices, the stronger the denials rose from institutions. This dissonance created fertile ground for rumor. Some claimed governments were preparing secret bunkers in mountain ranges, while others insisted entire navies were positioned to monitor resonance waves. Conspiracy forums exploded with theories that Atlas was not natural at all but engineered, a fragment of some ancient machine or weapon drifting across the stars. Most of these theories were wild, unmoored from evidence, yet hidden among them, the real warnings lay buried, unheard, drowned by noise. The most poignant warnings came not from scientists but from ordinary people. In coastal Ghana, a fisherman named Kofi uploaded a video showing the ocean flattening into unnatural stillness before dawn. His voice cracked as he whispered, "The sea is waiting for something." In Alaska, a hunter filmed the sky humming with auroras that made his rifle vibrate in his hands. "This is not the sun," he said. "This is something else." These videos spread, captured millions of views, but they were consumed as entertainment more than evidence. People watched, shivered, then scrolled onward. In Reykjavik, Emil followed these voices obsessively. He recognized in them the same fear he carried, the same patterns he had traced in secret. He began reaching out anonymously, offering fragments of his data to anyone willing to listen. But his emails went unanswered, or worse, mocked. One reply, curt and cruel, read simply, "You people are chasing ghosts. Stop wasting our time." Emil shut his laptop and stared into the dark, wondering whether silence was more dangerous than ridicule. And yet, he knew the warnings mattered. For while the world turned its eyes upward in awe at the fractured wanderer glowing brighter each night, the oceans and skies were already moving to its song. The hums grew stronger, the auroras shimmered in unnatural rhythms. Seismographs recorded pulses that no tectonic theory could explain. The warnings were not unheard, they were ignored. Perhaps that was worse. Tides in rebellion. By the time the warnings had been dismissed, censored, or drowned in the noise of conspiracy, the oceans themselves began to rebel. It was no longer a matter of whispers in hydrophone data or slight deviations in tide charts. Now, the seas moved in ways no one could deny, not even the most skeptical. Something vast was stirring, and it was no longer subtle. It began with anomalies at coastal monitoring stations. In Hawaii, instruments registered waves rising against the prevailing wind, their crests moving inland even when the winds blew outward. At first, oceanographers blamed unusual storm systems, but there were no storms. The skies were clear, the air calm, yet the waves pushed against reason. Similar reports arrived from Australia, Chile, South Africa. Buoys bobbed not in the rhythm of tides, but in sharp, synchronized pulses, as though the ocean itself had chosen a beat to follow. Then came the synchronized surges. On one night in late spring, tide gauges across the Pacific reported simultaneous spikes, small, perhaps half a meter in height, but eerily identical, occurring thousands of kilometers apart within minutes of each other. The oceans had moved not as isolated basins, but as a single, coordinated body. This could not be explained by wind, nor moon, nor tectonics. It was resonance made visible, the ocean playing the note it had been taught by the scarred wanderer above. Coastal communities were the first to feel it in their bones. Fishermen in Peru described waters pulling their boats sideways, tugging against familiar currents. In Indonesia, pearl divers surfaced in panic, speaking of currents that circled them in perfect, unnatural spirals. In Alaska, trawlers returned with stories of nets dragged violently downward as if the sea itself had clenched in anger. These were not storms, not waves, they were movements with intent, patterns too deliberate to be dismissed as chance. On the western coast of Africa, a group of children playing by the shoreline saw the sea retreat suddenly, bearing rocks never revealed at low tide. They laughed, ran across the sand, chasing crabs. Then, without warning, the water returned not in a gradual swell but in a sudden, violent rush that sent waves crashing higher than any local memory. The children escaped, soaked and terrified, their parents rushing to pull them from the surf. Later, the elders shook their heads. They spoke of old stories of black tides that rose without storm, warnings passed through generations. The sea had repeated its lesson, and still few would listen. Scientists scrambled to interpret the data. In Tokyo, a team of oceanographers compared the synchronized surges to harmonic oscillations. Their models suggested that the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans were beginning to vibrate as one. "It is as if the oceans are joining hands," one researcher murmured, staring at the graphs. "They are not separate bodies anymore. They are one organism, answering to something beyond us." His report, stamped confidential, never reached the public, yet the rebellion could not be hidden. Satellite imagery revealed vast patterns in the seas, lines of swells stretching across thousands of kilometers, not random but geometric, like ripples forming from a single invisible strike. Meteorologists, baffled, attempted to blame them on climate fluctuations, but their explanations rang hollow. Pilots flying over the Pacific described endless fields of waves moving in unison, defying wind, defying storm, as though the ocean had chosen to march in step. In Reykjavik, Emil traced the data with trembling hands. He compared the surges to Atlas's emissions, aligning timestamps with comet-brightening events. The synchronization was perfect. Each pulse of fractured light above matched a surge of rebellious water below. The comet was not merely influencing the seas, it was conducting them, a silent maestro pulling the oceans into its broken rhythm. Public perception began to shift. The anomalies were too widespread, too visible to deny. Videos of rogue waves moving against calm skies flooded the internet. Families posted footage of water rising in harbors without warning, lifting boats as though by invisible command. Sailors whispered that the ocean was no longer safe, that it carried moods beyond human comprehension. Even the most skeptical began to admit something was wrong. Yet governments held their silence. Press conferences continued to frame Atlas as harmless, a cosmic spectacle. Officials dismissed the anomalies as rare meteorological coincidences, but the people who lived by the sea knew better. They felt it in the pull of their boats, in the way the tide crept higher on calm days, in the silence that often preceded the swells. The ocean was no longer obeying the moon. It had found another master, and through it all, Atlas grew brighter in the sky. To casual stargazers it was a wonder, a jewel above the horizon. To those who understood, it was a scar pulsing with resonance, teaching Earth's oceans the song of rebellion. The seas had begun to move against their ancient patterns, as if reminding humanity that they were not bound to serve quietly. They could rise, and when they did, it would not be in chaos, but in unison. The tides were no longer tides. They were rehearsals, echoes beneath the crust. The rebellion of the tides should have been warning enough, but the seas were not the only parts of Earth answering to the scarred wanderer in the sky. Beneath the crust, where stone pressed against stone in silence, something deeper began to stir. At first, the tremors were so faint they escaped notice, buried in the endless hum of natural seismic activity. But careful eyes, those of seismologists scattered across the globe began to notice a pattern. In California, a research team monitoring fault lines detected pulses too regular to be tectonic stress releases. The vibrations repeated with eerie precision, rising not from the grinding of plates but from nowhere, as though the Earth itself had begun to hum. Their frequency aligned not with local geology but with the timing of Atlas's fractured emissions. The researchers exchanged uneasy glances, their equipment recording what seemed less like quakes and more like echoes. In Japan, similar anomalies appeared in the data. Seismographs in quiet regions, far from volcanic belts or major faults, began to quiver in patterns measured not in random bursts, but in waves, low, steady pulses that could not be explained by tectonics. A young graduate student plotted them against comet observations and froze when the alignment revealed itself. Each time Atlas brightened, Earth trembled faintly, not in chaos but in rhythm. She shared her findings with her professor, who stared long into the graphs before muttering, "It is not the Earth cracking, it is the Earth listening." The most chilling data came from South America. Along the Andes, instruments recorded subterranean rumbles that traveled far too quickly and uniformly to be natural. They swept through the ground like the strum of a string plucked across an instrument, vibrating from one end of a continent to another. These were not earthquakes. They were resonant waves in the planet's bones. Geologists began whispering the unthinkable. What if resonance was not confined to the oceans? What if the fractured song of Atlas was sinking deeper, reaching into the mantle, coaxing the Earth's very structure into harmony with its broken rhythm? Leaked reports revealed dark possibilities. If resonance touched tectonic plates, the consequences would be beyond imagination. Pressure zones already strained might rupture in unison. Entire fault systems could slip simultaneously, triggering earthquakes not as isolated disasters, but as chained events across the globe. Volcanoes, fed by pressure from beneath, might awaken in chorus. The Earth's crust, once thought of as unyielding, could become a drumhead struck by the song of a scarred star. The public never heard these words officially, but whispers escaped. Anonymous forums carried snippets of graphs, shaky videos of scientists speaking with voices lowered in fear. One such clip, recorded secretly during a university seminar in Iceland, showed a professor tapping the table in front of him, slow and deliberate. "If you strike the Earth here," he said, "the vibration travels here, here, and here. But if something strikes in resonance, the whole table moves. That is what we are seeing. The whole Earth is beginning to move together." Created live. On the ground, ordinary people began to notice strange phenomena. In Chile, farmers reported wells vibrating faintly, the water rippling even on windless nights. In Greece, shepherds spoke of stones shifting under their feet with no quake to explain them. In Siberia, miners paused in their tunnels as the walls hummed with a low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Dogs howled at night, restless, their ears pressed to the ground as if hearing something buried deep below. The old stories resurfaced yet again. In Norse myth, they recalled Jormungandr, the great serpent coiled around the earth, stirring restlessly before Ragnarok, its movements shaking both land and sea. In Hindu tradition, tales spoke of the cosmic turtle shifting its back, shaking the world above. These were no longer read as allegories, they were seen as memories of resonance, as echoes of the last time Earth's crust had joined the song of a scarred wanderer. In Reykjavik, Emil compared seismic data with tide records and comet pulses. The alignment was undeniable. What terrified him most was the speed at which the phenomenon was escalating. The oceans had rebelled first, but now the land itself was joining. Water and stone were no longer separate. They were harmonizing, vibrating in unison. Governments, unable to suppress the spread of anomalies, shifted their tone. Press conferences admitted to unusual seismic patterns, but attributed them to natural variability. Yet their actions betrayed their fear. Military bases quietly relocated inland. Underground shelters expanded at frantic speed. Satellite networks increased their monitoring not just of oceans, but of seismic hotspots across the world. Behind their silence, preparations screamed louder than words. Meanwhile, Atlas gleamed ever brighter, its fractured body shimmering like a wound refusing to close. Astronomers noticed its emissions growing more erratic, its pulses stronger, its tail weaving patterns that resembled harmonic waves. Some whispered that it was not simply passing by but deliberately shedding its resonance into the void, as though scattering the memory of its own destruction onto any world it encountered. And Earth was listening. The oceans hummed, the crust trembled, the planet's voice, long silent, was being coaxed into a song older than memory, a song of fracture, a song of endings, the fracturing trust. The Earth's tremors were still subtle enough that most of the world did not feel them, but the silence from governments could no longer mask what people were seeing with their own eyes. The seas surged against reason, the skies shimmered with restless auroras far from the poles, dogs howled at invisible vibrations, and in quiet places, wells rippled without wind. The world had begun to notice. What fractured next was not only the land beneath humanity's feet, but the fragile trust between people and those who claimed to lead them. It started with leaks more frequent, more undeniable than before. Blurry images of classified graphs circulated on underground forums. Screenshots of seismic data, stamped with government logos, showed clear synchronization between Atlas's pulses and tremors beneath the crust. Satellite images of coastlines revealed unnatural lines of waves stretching thousands of kilometers. No amount of denial could hide what was plainly visible. The first protests began in coastal cities. In Manila, thousands gathered near the bay, holding signs that read, "Tell us the truth, and we have the right to know." Their chants were carried by winds that smelled faintly of salt, their voices breaking as officials refused to acknowledge what everyone could see. The water had been rising at odd hours, flattening and surging without storm. In New York, demonstrators marched through Lower Manhattan, carrying images of Atlas projected across skyscrapers, the comet depicted as a jagged scar bleeding light into the sky. Their demand was not survival, it was honesty. But honesty never came. Instead, governments doubled down. Press conferences emphasized natural climate variability. Scientists loyal to institutions appeared on television, carefully choosing words that reassured without lying outright. There is no confirmed evidence of a threat. Yet their eyes betrayed them, their voices unsteady, and viewers noticed. Ordinary people are always sharper than authorities expect. In Reykjavik, Emil watched the protests unfold online, his chest heavy with dread. He had seen the data. He knew the truth. The trust that once bound society was dissolving faster than the glaciers around him. He understood why governments withheld the full story. Panic was as deadly as waves, but he also knew the silence was corrosive. People already suspected. In silence, suspicion metastasized into rage. Rumors filled the void. Some claimed governments were building massive inland bunkers for elites, leaving the rest of humanity to drown. Others believed Atlas was no comet at all but a weapon, an interstellar remnant deliberately aimed to destroy Earth. Still others whispered that ancient prophecies had foretold this moment, and that the silence of leaders confirmed their inevitability. These rumors spread faster than facts, feeding on the vacuum of truth. As fear grew, fractures appeared between nations. Coastal states demanded answers, accusing powerful inland nations of hoarding knowledge and preparation. Island nations, already vulnerable, pleaded for evacuation support, only to be met with empty reassurances. In private, many governments had already abandoned plans to save their coasts, focusing instead on securing highlands, farmlands, and inland infrastructure. To the leaders, it was triage. To their citizens, it was betrayal. Religious groups flourished in the uncertainty. Some preached that Atlas was divine punishment, a judgment upon humanity. Others saw it as a harbinger of renewal, urging followers to embrace the coming flood as a cleansing. Temples and churches overflowed, while others emptied in despair. Trust in institutions crumbled, replaced by desperate faith in whatever narrative offered comfort. The media fractured too. Independent journalists risked their lives to publish leaked reports, many of which vanished quickly under government pressure, but not quickly enough. Screenshots were copied, saved, shared, impossible to erase completely. A leaked American defense analysis describing continent-level inundation spread through encrypted channels, sparking waves of panic purchases in supermarkets. In France, a video of a scientist admitting that the oceans are rehearsing reached millions before being scrubbed, only fueling suspicion. Each attempt to silence the truth only confirmed to the public that something was terribly wrong. Families fractured as well. In coastal towns, arguments broke out between those who insisted on leaving for higher ground and those who clung to their homes, unwilling to abandon lifetimes of roots for rumors. Inland cities faced sudden influxes of quiet refugees, people who claimed they were simply visiting relatives, but carried with them the weight of fear. Housing markets in highland regions soared, while coastal properties plummeted in value overnight. The fracture was not just trust, it was geography, class, survival. One night, a viral video captured the fracture perfectly. It showed a town hall meeting in New Zealand, where citizens demanded answers from a government representative. A fisherman stood up, voice shaking, and shouted, "I don't need your models. I saw the sea breathe. I saw it move without wind. Tell me why." The representative stammered platitudes about natural anomalies, but the room erupted in jeers. The video ended with chants of "lies, lies," echoing against wooden rafters. And through it all, Atlas hung above, brighter than any star, its fractured light impossible to ignore. Each night it rose, people looked upward and felt the truth governments refused to speak. Trust in the ground beneath their feet had begun to fracture. Trust in leaders had shattered entirely. Humanity was entering the resonance not only of oceans and crust, but of fear itself, reverberating through societies until cohesion began to break apart. Emile wrote in his notebook, "The fracture begins not with the earth but with us. The ocean will split continents. Fear will split people. Both are inevitable." And as he set down his pen, far away in Tokyo, a seismograph needle twitched violently, recording a pulse so strong that even those untrained in science could see it for what it was. The earth had answered again. The first surge, the fractures of trust had deepened into chaos, but still there were those who believed the government's assurances, who clung to the thought that all anomalies could be explained away by storms, by shifting climates, by error. That illusion ended on a single night in early summer, when the ocean at last unveiled the first true surge. It began in the Pacific. The evening was calm across thousands of kilometers, the skies clear, winds soft, the stars sharp and unmoving. In Fiji, children played by the water as families cooked on beaches, while in Hawaii tourists sipped drinks along the shoreline, watching the bright scar of Atlas glowing faintly above. There was no warning, no storm brewing on the horizon. The ocean simply stilled. For 10 minutes, it was as though the sea had exhaled and gone silent, a glassy expanse without wave or ripple. Those who stood on the sand noticed the silence first. No gulls, no insects, only the quiet breathing of the crowd. Then the water rose. It did not rise like an ordinary wave, building from the distance until it broke upon the shore. It rose as one body, the entire horizon swelling upward in a slow, impossible heave. Sailors on ships far out at sea later described it as though the ocean itself had lifted its chest to breathe, drawing every vessel upward in a terrible stillness before letting them plunge down again. The surge came not from wind, nor from quake, but from resonance, the ocean answering Atlas with a note that shook the night. In the islands of Tonga, people saw the horizon bulge like the back of a great beast. Within minutes, water surged inward, sweeping through villages, tearing palm trees from their roots. Entire coastlines vanished beneath walls of water that moved with unnatural unity. Families fled uphill, clutching children, their screams lost in the roar of the flood. In Samoa, harbours that had been calm a moment before were shattered, boats lifted like toys and hurled into streets. Satellites recorded it in real time, their sensors capturing the spread of the wave across the Pacific basin. Unlike ordinary tsunamis, which move outward from a point of rupture, this surge spread in a perfect ring, expanding from nowhere, as though the entire ocean floor had been struck at once. Analysts in secure rooms stared at the unfolding data with disbelief. "This isn't seismic," one whispered. "This is harmonic." Within hours, fragments of the truth began to surface online. Amateur radio operators reported strange interference minutes before the surge. Fishermen uploaded shaky videos of the ocean rising all at once. Their voices panicked, their boats tilting violently. From Hawaii came grainy footage of water rushing inland, engulfing cars, shattering windows. The videos spread faster than officials could suppress them. By morning, the world had seen it. The ocean, calm and vast, suddenly rising in unison to devour the land. Governments scrambled to respond. Press conferences spoke of rare undersea events, of tectonic slips beneath the Pacific. But the explanations were too thin, too rehearsed, and the people no longer believed. For the first time, resonance had revealed itself in daylight, undeniable, captured not by instruments but by human eyes. The first surge had broken more than coastlines, it had broken denial. Scientists issued frantic internal reports. The surge, they explained, had not released energy, it had transferred it. The oceans, once stirred, did not calm but retained the resonance, vibrating faintly even after the flood subsided. This was not the event, Dr. Marovic wrote in a private memo. This was the rehearsal. The true night will come when resonance aligns across all basins. When that happens, it will not be islands, it will be continents. In Reykjavik, Emil watched the footage in silence. He saw children swept from beaches, harbors destroyed, villages erased. He heard the screams, the silence that followed, the voices trembling behind cameras. And more than all of that, he saw the look of the water itself, the way it rose as one body, moved as if it had chosen its own will. He closed his notebook and wrote a single line. The sea has learned its song. Around the world, people began to flee the coasts. Highways clogged with traffic. Families packed their lives into cars, and inland cities swelled with refugees. The first surge had made the unimaginable real. No government assurance, no scientific dismissal could erase the image of oceans rising without storm. And still, above it all, Atlas gleamed brighter than ever, its fractured light flickering in time with the new restlessness of Earth. Observatories recorded a powerful emission the same night the surge occurred, a pulse of fractured brightness unlike any seen before. The Wanderer had sung, and the ocean had answered. The first surge was not the end. It was only the first note in a song still building, a song that promised not just to drown islands but to split continents, to remake the world in a single night. Continents tremble. The first surge had ripped away the last veil of denial. For centuries, oceans had been seen as chaotic, yet predictable, governed by winds, by the pull of the moon, by storms and seasons. That night, when the Pacific rose in silence, humanity saw the ocean move to a rhythm older and deeper than any tide chart. The fear that followed was not of storms, but of harmony, an alien harmony now taking hold of the earth itself. And in the weeks that followed, it was not only the seas that moved, the continents began to tremble. The first fractures appeared in South America. Along the Andes, a series of tremors rippled through mountain valleys, not violent enough to destroy cities, but unsettling in their uniformity. Seismographs recorded them not as random bursts, but as waves, pulses moving through the crust in steady rhythms. Scientists stared at the readings, whispering the word they dared not publish: resonance. These tremors did not resemble ordinary quakes. They resembled a great instrument being plucked, its notes traveling through the stone. In the Himalayas, mountaineers felt vibrations humming through the rock beneath their tents. Sherpas, seasoned by generations of guiding, shook their heads and muttered of ancient stories, tales of mountains swaying when the sky sent a broken star. Instruments confirmed their unease. Low-frequency tremors rippled through the range, vibrating the highest peaks in patterns aligned with the same intervals that stirred the oceans. Even the roof of the world was listening. In North America, deep beneath Yellowstone, monitors picked up swelling magma movements, subtle but undeniable. The chambers stirred as if responding to a distant call, pressure rising without eruption. A volcanologist, reviewing the data in private, wrote a note in the margin of his report. If the ocean is the swing, then the crust is the drum. Both are being played. He locked the report in a drawer, knowing the words would never see public release. The most terrifying evidence came from Africa's Great Rift Valley. Instruments there recorded deep vibrations echoing through the tectonic rift, stretching for thousands of kilometers. These were not ordinary stress releases. They were harmonic pulses, synchronized with tremors detected half a world away in South America. The continents were not trembling in isolation, they were trembling together. Governments scrambled to hide the truth, but the earth betrayed them. In coastal cities, people felt sudden shudders underfoot, short but rhythmic, like a giant heartbeat rising from the ground. Windows rattled, bridges swayed, animals bolted in panic. The quakes were too shallow, too gentle to destroy, but their uniformity terrified. It was not destruction yet, it was rehearsal, just as the surges had been rehearsals of waves. Meanwhile, Atlas glared brighter in the heavens, its fractured light flickering erratically, its emissions stronger with each passing week. Astronomers reported bursts of radiation, unlike anything recorded in known comets. Brief, stuttering pulses that traveled across space like the strikes of an invisible drum. Each pulse coincided with tremors in Earth's crust. The connection was undeniable. The Wanderer was not simply influencing the seas, it was conducting the planet. For ordinary people, the trembling continents shattered what little trust remained. Rumors became certainty. Governments were lying. Panic spread inland as videos of trembling streets and swaying buildings flooded the internet. Farmers abandoned fields, convinced the soil beneath them would split. Families fled to highlands, only to find the ground there trembling too. There was no safety. Everywhere, the earth hummed with the same restless rhythm. In Reykjavik, Emil traced the seismic data, aligning it with the comet's pulses. The resonance pattern was growing stronger, its amplitude rising with each day. He wrote in his notebook, "The oceans were the first instrument. Now the crust is joining. When they play together, the song will break the world." He shuddered as he realized the truth. This was no mere natural event, it was choreography, the earth being tuned toward a single, catastrophic crescendo. Myths once dismissed as fantasy now spread with new urgency. The Norse sagas of Ragnarok spoke of seas and earth convulsing as one. Hindu scriptures described the cosmic drum whose beat shook land and water alike. Indigenous elders recalled stories of valleys split in a single night, of mountains toppling as seas rose. People no longer mocked these tales, they saw them unfolding in real time. And still, the governments held their silence. Press conferences continued, thin and brittle, their words drowned by the shaking ground. Officials spoke of unusual seismic clusters, of rare tidal behavior, but no one believed them. The silence of trust had already broken. Now the silence of the earth itself was breaking too, filled with a low hum that no denial could suppress. Then, one night, seismographs across the world lit up at once. From Chile to Iceland, from Alaska to Indonesia, pulses struck the earth in near-perfect unison, not random but harmonic, a global tremor that lasted 3 full minutes. No great damage was done, walls cracked, windows shattered, but cities remained standing. Yet scientists knew what they were seeing. The continents had trembled together, as if the planet itself had taken a single shuddering breath. Above, Atlas flared, brighter than ever before, its fractured body glowing like a wound on the canvas of the night. The Wanderer's scar pulsed, and Earth had answered. The trembling was no longer rehearsal, it was prelude. The longest night, it began without storm, without warning, without even the faint tremors that so often came before disaster. It began with silence. On that night, across the globe, the seas fell still. In harbors from Sydney to San Francisco, from Manila to Marseille, fishermen paused mid-task and looked out across waters as smooth as black glass. Winds ceased, birds vanished. Even the insects grew quiet. A silence so absolute descended that children woke in their beds, uneasy without knowing why, and dogs whimpered in their sleep. Humanity stood unknowingly at the threshold of its longest night. At 9:14 p.m. GMT, Atlas pulsed. Astronomers recorded a sudden flare in its fractured core, a burst of light so bright it cast shadows on observatory walls. For a brief moment, the scarred wanderer glowed brighter than any star, its jagged body bleeding light into the void. Instruments captured a spike of emissions, unlike anything seen before, deep, rhythmic pulses, as if the comet itself had struck a chord across the cosmos. 2 minutes later, the oceans rose. They did not rise in waves as people understood them. They rose as a single body, water heaving upward across basins as vast as continents, surging against coastlines in perfect unison. In the Pacific, harbors disappeared beneath walls of water 50 meters high. In the Atlantic, shores from Brazil to Spain drowned in minutes. In the Indian Ocean, waves tore across islands, splitting villages apart in silence before the roar came crashing back. It was not a tsunami born of rupture, it was resonance unleashed, the oceans moving as one, their rebellion complete. As the waters surged, the land trembled. Seismographs erupted in chaos as tectonic plates slipped in terrifying harmony. Fault lines that had been dormant for centuries ruptured in the same hour. California shook as the San Andreas gave way. Turkey split along the North Anatolian fault. The Andes groaned and buckled. From the Himalayas to the Alps, mountains cracked and avalanched as if struck by a single, invisible blow. It was not coincidence. It was orchestration. Volcanoes awoke in chorus. Stromboli erupted with a scream of fire. Kilauea spilled rivers of molten stone. The great caldera of Yellowstone rumbled, venting clouds of ash into the black sky. Across the Pacific Rim, The ring of fire blazed in unison, fountains of magma piercing the darkness. To those who survived long enough to see it, it was as if the earth itself had torn open its lungs to cry. The night became chaos. Cities drowned before sirens could sound. Entire islands disappeared beneath walls of water. Bridges buckled and split as ground heaved beneath them. Towers swayed and collapsed. Lights went out, grids failing one after another, until the world lay in darkness, lit only by fire and flood. Millions cried out at once, voices swallowed by the roar of oceans that no longer obeyed gravity but the song of a broken wanderer. In Reykjavik, Emil watched the earth tremble through his instruments, each screen flashing red with seismic alarms. He heard glass shattering in his apartment, books tumbling from shelves, the deep groan of stone beneath the city. Through the window, he saw the horizon flicker with auroras, burning red and green as if the sky itself were splitting. His hands trembled as he wrote in his notebook, though he knew no one might ever read it. The ocean has risen, the land has broken, the song is complete. Across the world, myths were reborn in blood and water. In Norway, villagers whispered that Ragnarok had come, the serpent stirring at last. In India, priests cried that the cosmic drum was beating. In Polynesia, elders wept as the seas swallowed their islands, just as their ancestors had warned. The old stories, dismissed for centuries, had revealed their truth. The scarred star had sung, and the world had split. By dawn, entire nations were gone. Coastlines had shifted, islands had vanished, maps had become lies. Tens of millions had perished in the span of hours, swept away in darkness as the seas tore across continents and mountains shuddered underfoot. Survivors clung to highlands, dazed, watching the horizon where oceans still moved unnaturally, as though reluctant to settle. And above them, in the pale light of a shattered dawn, Atlas still gleamed. Its fractured body pulsed faintly, no longer flaring as before, but steady now, as if the song had been sung and silence reclaimed. To some, it looked like a wound healing. To others, it looked like a scar that promised more. The longest night had ended, but the world it revealed was not the same. The aftermath of silence. When dawn broke, after the longest night, it revealed a planet unrecognizable. The oceans that had risen in rebellion did not retreat to their old boundaries. They lingered, carved new coastlines, and left behind maps no cartographer could have imagined. Nations were gone, swallowed whole. Cities that had thrived for centuries lay beneath grey-green waves, their towers jutting from the sea like the bones of drowned giants. Highways led into nothingness, rivers emptied into new inlets. The world humanity had known was erased, replaced by a geography forged in a single night of resonance. Survivors stumbled from hillsides and mountains, their eyes hollow, their mouths dry with disbelief. They carried nothing but the clothes on their backs, the cries of children, the weight of memory. Villages that had once overlooked calm harbours now gazed down on vast inland seas. Where farmland had stretched in fertile green, salt water gleamed under a rising Sunday. The survivors stood in silence, listening to waves that had not existed the day before, and understood that history had ended. Communication was fractured. Satellites had failed during the resonance surges. Entire grids had collapsed as waters consumed coastal infrastructure. The internet was gone in most places, reduced to fragmented signals picked up by a few surviving stations. Radios crackled with broken voices, desperate calls for aid. Coordinates whispered in static, cries from ships adrift on oceans that no longer obeyed charts. There were no governments left to answer, no agencies capable of relief. Each message was an island of fear calling into the void. Inland cities fared better, though they too bore scars. Earthquakes had shaken their foundations, ruptured bridges, and toppled towers. Volcanoes had darkened skies with ash, choking crops and painting sunsets in furious reds. But compared to the drowned coasts, they seemed like sanctuaries. Refugees poured into them, swelling their numbers beyond capacity. Tension rose quickly. Food dwindled. Clean water vanished. Fear sharpened into anger. Trust, already fractured before the night, now shattered entirely. Survival became the only law. Religious movements exploded in the aftermath. Survivors clung to ancient stories, reinterpreting them as prophecy fulfilled. In South America, preachers declared the resonance the return of the flood, a divine cleansing of the wicked. In Iceland, some whispered that Ragnarok had come, and that only those who survived were chosen to rebuild. Others, less certain, saw no gods at all, only the cold indifference of the cosmos, a scarred wanderer carrying destruction across the stars. The most haunting silence, however, was not in cities or refugee camps but along the new coastlines. Survivors who dared approach the water found it eerily calm, as if exhausted by its own violence. It lapped gently at shores it had claimed, as though nothing had happened. Yet those who listened closely swore they could still hear the hum, the deep, rhythmic vibration buried beneath the surface. The ocean was not done. It was resting. In Reykjavik, Emil survived. His city, perched on high ground, had escaped the worst of the flooding. Though quakes had cracked streets and reduced homes to rubble, he emerged from the wreckage of his apartment carrying the notebook he had filled for months, its pages damp but intact. He wandered through crowds of dazed survivors who gathered in open squares, lighting fires against the ash-filled wind. He heard their questions. What happened? Will it come again? No one answered. He did not answer either. He knew the truth. The resonance was not finished. From the high cliffs of Iceland, Emil looked out across a coastline that had shifted overnight. Fjords had expanded into wide gulfs. Islands had vanished beneath new waters. He saw ships stranded far inland where waves had carried them, their hulls lying broken among shattered houses. Smoke rose in the distance where fires burned uncontrolled. The sea itself glittered unnaturally under the light of dawn, as if proud of the land it had claimed. Elsewhere, scattered bands of survivors attempted to organize. In the highlands of Peru, Quechua communities gathered refugees and offered them ancient stories as guidance. Tales of valleys drowned and reborn, of ancestors who had fled to the mountains. In Japan, survivors clung to mountain temples, ringing bells in mourning for coastal towns erased in hours. In Africa's Rift Valley, displaced families spoke of the earth itself rebelling, recalling myths of gods who once split the land in anger. Nations, as they had been, no longer existed. Borders were meaningless when rivers and coasts were erased. Military forces that remained intact acted less as defenders than as lords of fractured territories, deciding who would be fed and who would be abandoned. Some chose mercy, offering what aid they could. Others hoarded, preparing for wars in a world already broken. And still, above it all, Atlas shone. No longer pulsing as it had during the night, its fractured glow now steady, dimmer, as if the comet itself had quieted after the song. To astronomers who survived, this was the most terrifying sign of all. The wanderer had not vanished. It had only paused. In hushed whispers, survivors spoke of what might come next. Some said the worst had passed, that the oceans had spent their fury. Others believed the first surge, the longest night, were only preludes. The comet was still approaching perihelion, still weeks from its closest passage. What had been endured might only be the beginning. Emil sat on the cliffs with his notebook and wrote with shaking hands. The silence after is worse than the sound of the flood, because silence means waiting. The sea has not forgotten, the earth has not forgotten, and Atlas is still above us. The aftermath was silence, yes, but it was not peace. It was the pause between notes, the breath before the next chord. A world transformed. The silence that followed the longest night did not bring relief. It brought revelation. As days turned into weeks, humanity began to understand that it no longer lived on the same earth. The world had been transformed, reshaped not by centuries of erosion or slow tectonic drift, but in the span of hours. The resonance had redrawn the face of the planet, and with it, the boundaries of human imagination. From orbit, surviving satellites captured images of continents split and scarred. The Pacific had surged deep into the heart of the Americas, swallowing entire valleys and leaving new inland seas that glistened under the sun like wounds that would never heal. The Indian subcontinent was fractured, its coasts drowned, its plains broken into jagged peninsulas. Africa's Rift Valley had widened into a gaping scar, a newborn ocean slowly filling its depths. Europe's coastlines were unrecognizable. Great swaths of land torn away, rivers finding new paths towards seas that had claimed entire nations. Maps printed before the longest night were useless relics. In Asia, the Himalayas had shifted, shaken by resonant pulses that split peaks and redirected rivers. The Mekong Delta was gone, replaced by an endless inlet of salt water. The islands of the Pacific Oceania's ancient jewels were scattered fragments, many erased entirely. Survivors clung to the highlands that remained, gazing out at horizons that had shifted overnight. whispering prayers to ancestors who had sung of such floods before. The transformations were not only of land but of life. Species vanished in silence, swept away with their habitats, forests drowned, grasslands salt-poisoned, coral reefs shattered by waves that had struck them with the force of continents moving. Yet in the wreckage, new patterns began. Fish swam into valleys where farmland once lay. Birds wheeled over inland seas still steaming with the heat of fresh volcanic eruptions. The earth had not ended. It had remade itself, as it always had. The planet had sung a new song, and life would adapt to its rhythm, whether humanity could or not. Survivors wandered through these landscapes like exiles in a dream. In South America, villagers who had lived generations in the shadow of the Andes now found themselves staring at a vast new sea lapping at the foot of mountains. In Africa, herders guided cattle away from drowned pastures, leading them onto strange new shores. In Europe, refugees gathered on cliffs above newly formed fjords, gazing at waters that had claimed their towns. Every step was disorientation. Every memory was betrayal. The social fabric of humanity tore further under the strain. Governments, already crippled, could no longer command nations that no longer existed. Power consolidated into fragment city-states on high ground, enclaves in mountain ranges, pockets of survivors clinging to elevated plateaus. Alliances shifted, not by treaties but by geography. Those who shared the same surviving uplands became kin, regardless of former borders. Old rivalries mattered less than access to food, to fresh water, to ground that had not split beneath them. Religious fervor reached its peak. In temples carved into cliffs above new seas, priests declared that Earth had been reborn, that Atlas was not a destroyer, but a midwife delivering the planet into a new age. Others spoke of judgment, of divine wrath fulfilled. Still others fell into despair, worshipping not gods but the comet itself, gazing at its fractured scar in the night sky with awe and terror, chanting prayers to the wanderer as if to appease it. Humanity had always sought meaning in catastrophe, and now meaning was the only anchor left. Scientists, those few who had survived with their data intact, began to speak openly at last. They described the resonance not as a miracle or curse, but as physics, as harmony between a fractured wanderer and a living world. They explained how oceans, skies, and crust had vibrated together, how once the critical frequency had been reached, no force on Earth could have silenced it. Their explanations brought no comfort. Knowledge without power is a cruel gift. Yet some clung to it, determined to record what had happened, so that survivors generations hence might remember. And Emil, still alive in Reykjavik, still clutching his battered notebook, walked along cliffs that overlooked a coastline he no longer recognized. Where once had been villages and harbors, there was now a vast inlet, salt water stretching farther than the eye could see. He saw families building huts from wreckage, lighting fires against the ash-filled air. He saw fishermen crafting rafts to test the new waters, their faces both fearful and determined. Humanity, broken yet stubborn, refused to vanish. At night, Emil gazed upward at Atlas, glowing, fractured and bright against the stars. It no longer pulsed with the violent bursts of the longest night. Instead, it shimmered faintly, like an ember burning itself out. He wondered if it had sung its song fully, if the resonance was finished, or if this was only the first movement of a longer symphony. The thought haunted him, that Earth was not unique, that other worlds had heard this song before, that Atlas carried destruction not by choice but by memory. Yet amid the ruins, something else stirred a grim sense of renewal. The survivors who gathered in scattered highlands began to speak not of rebuilding what was lost, but of adapting to what was new. The world had changed. Maps had been torn apart. The old nations were gone. But there was land to live on, water to drink, fish to catch, soil though scarred that might be sown again. Humanity had survived the longest night, and if it could survive that, perhaps it could survive anything. The world was transformed, and so were its people. They no longer belonged to the Earth they had known. They belonged to this new world, this scarred, humming, resonant planet that had answered a song sung by a broken star. And still, above, Atlas lingered, watching, waiting, the memory of water. Generations passed, and the longest night became a memory that lived not in maps or records, those had been washed away, but in stories. The survivors carried their grief into words, and their children listened around fires, on highland ridges overlooking seas that had not existed in their grandparents' youth. They called it many names: the night of resonance, the flood of stars, the day the seas remembered. Yet across cultures and continents, the story shared the same bones: a broken wanderer in the sky, an ocean that rose as one, a world torn apart and remade. Children grew up never knowing the old coastlines, never believing the stories of wide deltas or sprawling cities by the sea. To them, the drowned towers that jutted from the waters were ruins of giants, proof that the elders' tales were true. They asked questions in innocent voices. Why did the sea decide to rise? Why did the land break? And the answers were given in fragments: because the sky called to it, because the water remembered. In this new world, memory itself became survival. Communities built on high ground inscribed their warnings into stone, into song, into ritual. They spoke not of gods alone, but of patterns, of the harmony that bound sky, sea, and earth. They warned their children to listen for silence, to fear nights when the ocean stilled, to flee inland if the horizon rose in one body. They knew the resonance could return, perhaps not in their lifetime, but one day, when another scarred wanderer crossed the heavens, the myths of the past, once dismissed, now found new life. Ragnarok, the flood of Noah, the drowning of Atlantis, all were retold not as fables but as truths glimpsed by ancestors who had endured their own resonance events. What had seemed fragmented and fantastical was now seen as a long memory of water, passed from age to age. Humanity realized with bitter clarity that it had always known this story, had always sung it, but had chosen to forget. Forgetting had cost millions of lives. Scientists among the survivors fewer now, scattered, their instruments broken, attempted to preserve what they could. They etched equations into stone tablets, recorded data in journals bound with salvaged leather, whispered theories to apprentices in mountain caves where libraries once stood. They wrote not for their peers but for descendants, leaving a trail of knowledge like breadcrumbs across time. They wanted the future to understand that the resonance was not myth, that it could be predicted, perhaps even survived, if remembered. Their voices were uncertain, but their determination was clear: the world must not forget again. Emil lived long enough to see the first of these efforts take root. He became a wandering teacher, carrying his battered notebook from settlement to settlement, speaking of the comet, the oceans, the trembling earth. He showed children the scarred coastlines and explained that the world they knew was not eternal. He warned them that the sky would one day send another broken wanderer, and when it did, they must remember the signs: the silent seas, the restless skies, the trembling ground. Some listened with wide eyes, others with disbelief, but Emil wrote anyway. Memory was the only armor humanity could carry forward. When he died, his notebook was placed in a stone chest atop a hill overlooking a new sea. The cover was worn, the pages damp and frayed, but the words endured: the ocean does not forget, the earth does not forget, only we forget. And when we do, the water reminds us. His students wept, not only for him but for the burden he had carried, the truth he had refused to silence. Centuries later, his notebook, along with countless other fragments, became scripture. His words merged with songs, chants, and myths until they were indistinguishable from prophecy. Children were raised to look at the sky, not with wonder but with caution, to see in every comet a question: is this the one that will sing again? They grew into adults who built their homes higher, who carved warnings into stone, who treated the memory of water as both curse and guide. The earth itself bore the scars of the resonance. New continents had formed, new seas had carved their way inland. The maps of the old world were forgotten, replaced by the geography of survival. Yet even as humanity adapted, the hum remained. Those who listened by the shore swore they could still hear it, the low vibration beneath the waves, faint but unyielding, as though the ocean still remembered the song it had once sung. And in the night sky, the stars wheeled on, as they always had. Atlas, the scarred wanderer, had long since passed, trailing its fractured light into the void, carrying the memory of destruction to whatever world lay in its path next. But its legacy remained not in its body, but in the way Earth remembered it. In myths, in stories, in songs sung by fireside, in warnings etched into cliffs, the memory of water endured. It would endure as long as seas touched shorelines, as long as children listened to the tales of their elders, as long as humanity feared the silence before the flood. because water remembers what stone forgets. And one day, when another broken scar crosses the heavens, the oceans will remember again. The song will rise, the earth will answer, and the memory of water will be all that stands between survival and silence.